I lived in New Orleans in 2005 when Hurricane Katrina hit the city really hard. I came back after the storm. I evacuated for the storm itself, but when I came back, it was a completely changed city, not only because it was flooded and destroyed, but also because the insects were completely different. The fire ant before the storm was by far the most common ant, and it was nowhere to be seen. And of course, the termites, however, were absolutely fine. With the current hurricane season well upon us, and we've already seen a number of storms, I thought I'd answer the question, what happens to insects during hurricanes and floods? Well, of course, like everything else, insects will hunker down during a storm, and some of them will get blown around, some will get blown to a new place, some will survive, and some, of course, will drown. If an insect does survive the hurricane and ends up in a new place, the question now becomes how adaptive is that insect to its new environment? Insects that live in frequently flooded or flood-prone areas have a few tools in their toolkit. First, there's vertical evacuation. They just climb a tree or whatever vegetation is around them. I was once on a collecting expedition in the Amazon basin, and I got to see one of these frequent floods firsthand. And sure enough, if you walked out into the floodwaters, the flooded forest floor, you would find insects on the trees that weren't usually visible. They had just climbed up when the flood came. Here are a few photos of insects from that experience, and also some photos of tree stumps and floating logs that upon closer inspection turned out to be covered in termite refugees. So that was vertical evacuation, and vertical evacuation makes a lot of sense. However, during a hurricane, it becomes really hard to do because if you try to evacuate vertically and get out of the way of the flood, you're going to get blown away by the storm weather. So another option to those insects that can is forming rafts and floating on top of the floodwaters. And fire ants are, of course, famous for doing this. They'll all just hold hands and the whole colony will float up. The queen will be inside there somewhere also, and they'll float around until they find a new place to land. Now, after Hurricane Katrina, there were quite a few reports of these fire ant flotillas going around and landing places and stinging people, and it was a real nuisance. However, when I came back, all the fire ants were just gone, and that leads me to believe that maybe they can only survive this for so long. About a week and a half of being on the water proved to be way too much. And once again, we have a trait that did not go unnoticed by Hollywood.
Solenopsis mandibularis.
Known for their bite, the fire ants have evolved into remarkable architects. They are handy to get you in and out of difficult places.
Marvel's Ant-Man, coming to digital and Blu-ray.
It drives me crazy that they said fire ant bite. Fire ants do bite, but that's not what hurts. What hurts is when they sting you with the stinger that is on their butts. And they actually bite to hold on to get a good grip so they can really get that stinger into you. And that's what they do. They sting. And again, Marvel Studios, if you need a staff entomologist, I'm right here, and I've been here this whole time. And so here's a still movie clip of Ant-Man riding a fire ant raft to safety. When it comes to soil-dwelling insects, surviving a flood might depend on finding little air pockets under the soil and just hanging out there for a while. For moss and termites, I mentioned, after Hurricane Katrina, they were just fine. And this is what I think we think that they were doing, is they have these complex nests that are under the ground, and they're made out of the specific material called carton nest, we call it. They also hollow out trees, and they'll build this nest inside of a tree trunk. So if it's possible that the nest of the queen and everybody would vertically evacuate inside of that tree, but we don't see that. We didn't see that on the outside. But a way that they could survive is maybe that nesting material holds on to enough air bubbles that the termites can just survive that way, breathing air that's trapped inside of their nest. And also perhaps using these trees, these hollowed out trees, as snorkels. Another thing that an insect might do during a storm or a flood is just slowing down their metabolism. If they're capable of entering this kind of hibernation or stasis, then they won't require very much oxygen. And so the little breath that they do get lasts. And finally, a lot of insects might actually benefit from this type of disaster. I'm thinking flies and cockroaches and other insects that are opportunistic. They might do really well in this new environment. And so after a disaster, you might actually have a larger insect density, a larger insect biomass than you had in the place before the flood. In New Orleans, after the hurricane hit, there was a big market increase in the mosquito population. It was really concerning, but it turns out that there was a lot of standing water around and swimming pools that were vacant and not treated or anything like that. And so mosquitoes had all this new breeding ground, and that's why they got their populations increased. And second, we had a lot of cockroaches and especially a lot of flesh flies. And the flesh flies, of course, as a larva, they eat on rotting flesh, and there were a lot of dead animals around after Hurricane Katrina hit. What we don't know. So if we're going to talk about insects and flooding, we also need to talk about insects living in water. Now, there are quite a few freshwater insects that live most of their lives, or maybe all of their lives, completely under the water or in water. And these go. However, one good question is, why aren't there any insects in the ocean? There's literally insects in every other habitat on Earth. Antarctica has its own insects, but the oceans are completely insect-free, other than just a few that hang out sort of on the edges. Of course, there are a few hypotheses about this. I'm sure the answer is quite complex, but there's still a lot of questions that have not been answered. Another thing that researchers are focusing on is this termite called Odontotermes in Vietnam and in other areas in Southeast Asia. And these guys get into these dikes, and rice paddies are all cordoned off with dikes. And termites get into these dikes and build these nests. And they build big nests under the ground, and then they have big tunnels leading from the nest to either side of the dike. And ultimately what happens is water comes through those tunnels and completely undermines the dike, and it washes away. And it causes these catastrophic floods in Vietnam. And researchers are working on better control methods to not only control these termites, but to prevent them from happening in the first place.